Joey, you like movies about gladiators?
We sure do, Clarence. Gladiator, Spartacus, the upcoming Gladiator 2. They're great. They're all great, and gladiators are great. Over the past 1500 years or so, they've captured people's imaginations like few other aspects of Roman culture. But the true story of the gladiator is far stranger than fiction. Archaeology and history have taught us much about the lives of these condemned men, their odds of survival, their surprising wealth, even their sex lives. So let's take a look at the true, secret history of the gladiators. The origins of the gladiator are disputed. Many scholars believe gladiatorial combat was first introduced by the Etruscans, or Campanians, peoples who lived in Italy before Rome rose to its height. The practice was later adopted by the Romans. Whoever first invented the concept, it's clear that gladiators were originally associated with funeral rites. When a prominent citizen died, slaves or prisoners would be forced to fight each other in honor of the deceased, a way of celebrating the dead man's martial prowess and manly virtue. Over time, these fights became enormously popular as spectacles unto themselves. Maybe the best way to understand their popularity is to compare them to boxing, wrestling, or MMA matches. When a rich person died, the public could at least look forward to getting a good fight card out of it. Politically ambitious men soon realized that gladiators were a good way to buy a little popularity. Someone running for office might delay his dad's funeral 6 months just so he could stage a lavish combat around election time. Gladiators went from being something strictly associated with funerals, like soggy sandwiches and organ music, to being munera, mass entertainments provided by the rich as a sort of civic duty. Naturally, the person who really took this to the next level was Julius Caesar. He staged a huge battle involving 640 gladiators in silver armor to honor the death of his father. The thing was, his dad had died about 20 years beforehand. Many people see this as a real turning point, when gladiatorial combat ceased to be a religious or burial rite and openly and brazenly became what we might call a sport. Caesar's heir, the first Roman Emperor Augustus, began to regulate this sport. He recognized that such spectacles were inherently political and therefore potentially dangerous, so he limited the amount private citizens could spend on gladiators. He wanted to make sure credit for providing such entertainments went to the government, and by extension, himself. The Emperor Claudius took things further. He signed a law requiring local magistrates to pay 2/3 the cost of gladiator shows in their towns, effectively meaning that they had to buy their offices by providing gladiators to their subjects. But of course, gladiators were so much more than that. They influenced every aspect of Roman culture, from politics to religion to sex. More on that later. But who were these men? Where did the gladiators themselves come from? What were their lives like? And what fate awaited them? The answers may surprise you. Firstly, it's a myth that all gladiators were slaves, cruelly forced to fight and die in the arena. There were different classes of gladiators. They ended up in the biz for very different reasons, and their odds of survival ranged from basically 0 to excellent. The lowest order of gladiators were the Noxii. These were condemned criminals, whether slave or free, who had committed particularly terrible crimes. Such men were often damnati ad bestias, condemned to the beasts, i.e., forced to fight lions and tigers and bears with virtually no chance of coming out alive. These weren't gladiators as we think of them, but men sentenced to a very public, painful, and humiliating death. On the next rung up the ladder, we find criminals who were damnati ad ludum, condemned to the schools, in this case gladiator schools. These men would at least be given some training before being sent into the arena, and had a chance to survive and even thrive. Some of the best gladiators were captured enemy soldiers. The Romans were a warlike people, and they believed that a fighter who allowed himself to be captured and enslaved had lost his honor. By letting him fight in the arena, the Romans believed they were giving him a chance to redeem his dignity. In general, the most respected gladiators were auctorati. volunteers. Many of these men were retired legionaries. Some were regular citizens who were poor, indebted, had no other trade open to them, or were simply hungry for glory. Indeed, even some sons of prominent families signed up to fight in the arena. Multiple laws had to be passed to prevent dumb trust fund kids from running away to become gladiators and getting themselves killed. But by the same token, emperors also participated in gladiator games. And not just the obvious example, Commodus, also Caligula, Titus, and Hadrian. But it's worth dwelling on Commodus for a second. He did indeed fight in the Colosseum, as depicted in the movie Gladiator. However, it wasn't just a one-time thing, and it wasn't some calculated act. Commodus liked to dress up as Hercules and appear regularly as a gladiator, although he apparently only fought dudes who were wounded, old, or sick, or like malnourished lions who had jaundice.
You know, little kids and shit, old people who can't defend themselves, and that's perfect. You two face off, that's even Steven.
For him, it was a dumb publicity stunt, sort of the equivalent of a president entering America's Got Talent and demanding to be declared the winner. But Commodus also charged the government 1,000,000 sesterces each time he fought. It's hard to say exactly how much money that is, but something like the annual salary of 500 soldiers? You may be wondering, if most gladiators were slaves, or prisoners of war, or desperate guys with no other prospects, why would senators and emperors be so eager to climb into the ring? Wouldn't it be seen as beneath them? Well, being a gladiator was a double-edged sword. No pun intended. Despite the obvious dangers and the low life expectancy, top gladiators were the most famous people in the empire. Today, they're often likened to movie stars, rock stars, pro athletes, or all of these things combined. There's truth in that. Even local-level gladiators who never made it to the big leagues, so to speak, could become legends. In Pompeii, archaeologists found graffiti depicting the exploits of a volunteer gladiator named Marcus Attilius. In his first 2 fights, this green rookie defeated 2 champions who each had a dozen prior victories under their belts. It's not hard to imagine why rich kids, senators, and even emperors would have envied the fame and adulation heaped on successful gladiators. Romanticized images of gladiators were everywhere, their feats celebrated in high and low art. From the perspective of a peasant, even the life of an unfamous gladiator was probably an improvement. Gladiators were housed and fed well, with access to hygienic facilities and medical treatment. Throw in a chance to become a celebrity, and that doesn't sound like such a bad deal if your only alternative is living in a dank, dangerous slum with little hope of getting ahead. Especially when you consider that gladiators didn't actually fight that much. Most only fought a few times a year, maybe 1 to 5 bouts. But there was a terrible price to pay for this kind of employment. Gladiators were labeled infames, infamous or disreputable people. That meant they permanently sacrificed their rights, even if they were free volunteers and not slaves or criminals. Legally, someone labeled an infamous couldn't testify in court, couldn't bring a legal challenge against someone else, couldn't run for office, and could be subjected to corporal punishment. It was a status gladiators shared with sex workers and actors. There was a real ambivalence in Roman society about gladiators. On the one hand, they were very popular, but on the other hand, they were despised and denigrated, their lives forfeit. Indeed, free Romans used the word gladiator as an insult. Everyone who entered into the life of a gladiator became a slave in practice, even if they did so voluntarily. They had to swear to obey their lanista, or manager. Before they were allowed to fight, all gladiators also swore the following oath: I will endure to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword. If you're wondering about how long the average gladiator actually lasted, how often they actually got killed, we'll have more to say about that later. But in gladiator schools and barracks, the men were generally kept in locked cells overnight. They walked from place to place in chains and were forbidden to converse with fellow gladiators at mealtimes. What did they actually teach in gladiator school? How to fight, obviously, but as we've emphasized, gladiatorial combat was essentially a sport. Fighters trained in different styles and were equipped with different weapons. They fell into categories or types that audiences all over the empire would know and recognize. There were myrmilones, who wore heavy helmets, carried large shields, and fought with short swords. These men had to be tall and muscular because they were weighted down with so much equipment. Myrmilones often fought against Thracians, who were more lightly armored but more mobile. Thracians had smaller helmets, shields, and greaves, but also carried sika, curved swords designed to slice into an enemy's back and flanks. Retiarii had to be even lighter on their feet. They carried throwing nets and tridents. If they were lucky or skilled, their nets could ensnare their opponents, but when these attacks failed, they were virtually defenseless. Hoplomachai were modeled after the Greek warriors known as hoplites. They carried shields, throwing spears, and swords, a powerful arsenal to be sure, but their great weakness was that they were forced to fight barefoot, causing their feet to chafe and bleed in the sand of the arena. There were many other types of gladiators too, like Samnites and Gauls, whose martial styles were based on Rome's battlefield enemies. Considering the different types of gladiators, it's perhaps easier to comprehend how Romans could have viewed this as a sport. Apart from the sheer enjoyment of violence and the thrill of sudden death, we can imagine Romans arguing about whose fighting style was superior, not unlike MMA fans debating whether it's preferable to be a good kicker or a strong puncher, to have a tough ground game or be good on your feet. Despite the bloody nature of gladiator games, there actually was a sense of sportsmanship involved. As much as possible, an effort was made to pit gladiators against opponents with a similar skill and experience level. There were rules to gladiatorial combat, although we don't exactly know what they were. And there was even a referee called a summa rudis who would enforce these rules during fights. If someone's equipment broke, for instance, the referee would stop the match until repairs could be made. Referees were typically former gladiators, and they would yell advice and instructions to novice fighters. The refs could sometimes decide the fate of a gladiator by stopping an unfair attack or allowing it to go ahead, or by stopping the fight and declaring both men co-winners. Despite the fact they might one day be forced to kill each other, gladiators had a sort of fraternity and solidarity. They formed organizations to pay for each other's burials, including grave markers that recorded the dead gladiators' win-loss record. They also chipped in to provide compensation for the families of men who died in the arena. But that brings us to one of the most shocking aspects of gladiator culture: money. The games were about sport. They were about entertainment. They were kinda sorta about religion, and they were definitely about politics. But they were also about money. Gladiators were big business for the men who owned, trained, and managed them. But believe it or not, despite being slaves, outcasts, and infames, gladiators themselves could also become very rich. It was customary for gladiators to keep their winnings, or at least some percentage of them, even if they were slaves. For one fight, an enslaved gladiator could easily win more money than an average free citizen made in a year. Some gladiators were so valuable to their masters that they were allowed to live in mansions waited on by slaves, despite technically being slaves themselves. Many gladiators earned enough money to buy their freedom, but apart from money, there was another major perk to being a gladiator: sex. Roman history is replete with rumors and innuendos about the romantic exploits of gladiators, specifically the claim that they regularly enjoyed flings with high-class Roman ladies. For example, one persistent rumor holds that Commodus's real father wasn't Marcus Aurelius, but a gladiator who had a long-term affair with his mother. It's impossible to say whether any of this is true or just ancient gossip. Nevertheless, it's clear that gladiators did get laid plenty. Their handlers sometimes hired them out as escorts, and sometimes as bodyguards for wealthy women. The Roman poet Ovid wrote that the best place to pick up women was at the arena, since there were always so many there to see the show, and since gladiators basically made everyone horny. In fact, Augustus forced women to sit up in the cheap seats separate from the men below, in part to keep the women away from the gladiators, but also to keep them away from random dudes in the crowd and to prevent any improper behavior. Even the bodily fluids of gladiators were believed to radiate sexual power. Gladiator sweat was sold to women as a perfume, an aphrodisiac, and even a beauty cream. On her wedding night, a woman might put gladiator blood in her hair to ensure a successful consummation of the marriage. Despite this crazy level of objectification and the giving over of their bodies to violence, gladiators could and often did secure their freedom. As noted, any gladiator could buy his liberty from his lanista, or manager. Those who survived long enough were also freed as a matter of course. Indeed, the freeing of slaves was commonplace in the Roman world. It was considered cruel and miserly to keep one's slaves for too long. Freed gladiators were presented with a rudis, a ceremonial wooden sword, indicating that their time in the arena was over. Some of these men didn't want freedom. The great gladiator Flamma, who lived during the 2nd century AD, was offered a rudis 4 times. Each time he declined. He was finally killed in the arena at the age of 30, having fought in 34 matches. That brings us to perhaps the biggest question. How often did gladiators actually die fighting? The story of Flamma gives us a clue. Of his 34 matches, he only won 21. The other 13 were losses or draws. So it's definitely a myth that gladiators had to win or die. Ties were commonplace, and men who lost their bouts outright were also regularly spared. Most gladiators weren't trying to kill their opponents, but wound them. After all, they were members of the same bloody fraternity. Men like Flamma had a high probability of surviving even if they lost, because they were veterans. They had a fan base. The men who were likeliest to die were rookies who performed poorly in their early fights. Gladiators who developed their own brand, if you like, they were worth a fortune to their handlers, both in appearance fees and gambling. There wouldn't be much profit in managing gladiators if they had a 50% chance of dying every time they fought. It's hard to pinpoint the death rate, but the best estimate is that perhaps 10% of gladiator fights ended with a fatality. That's certainly gruesome, but we are talking about a society where half of people died before the age of 10. Death was cheap. The history of gladiators spans half a millennium, but the Golden Age ran from the 1st century BC to the 2nd century AD. In the later Roman Empire, as Christianity spread, gladiator shows became unfashionable, and were finally stopped altogether in 404 AD. Of course, gladiators, their tragedies and triumphs, have lived on in the popular imagination right up to the present day, and no doubt will continue to do so. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and a comment, and subscribe to History Snob for more. Thank you for watching.